Welcome everyone to my channel, Video Chess Training on YouTube. This is International Master William Paschall, and this is Grandmaster Chess Lessons Part 6. Continuing my series of highly instructive games played by top players. This game from the Russian Team Championship 2016. Players are Grandmaster Artemiev playing white, and Ernesto Inarkiev playing black. Two very strong players, well over 2600. Artemiev white here opens with c4. Black plays e5, so we have a reversed Sicilian English opening. And Artemiev plays g3. Nothing wrong with g3. Not as common as knight to c3, but oftentimes transposing between those two moves while avoiding some sidelines like knight to c3, bishop b4, for example. g3. Now knight f6 is the most common move, when black often tries to control d5, perhaps tries to play a reversed open Sicilian. White played bishop to g2, and now for the first original move of the game, h6. This is a very serious event, the Russian Team Championship, very strong event, many top players participating. This is not a joke move from Inarkiev here. I think that it's possible that these two players were friends and playing around a little bit here with the following moves, but h6 has been played before. It's a useful move in some variations because it controls the g5 square and indirectly fights for d5. It's possible that Artemiev and Inarkiev were just kind of playing around a little bit in the first few moves. Highly unusual series here, as you see next, a3. When I first saw this game, I honestly thought that it's possible that the two were just friends and sort of playing with each other at this point with h6 and a3. But these moves actually have quite a bit of significance in the position. Black particularly prevented from playing bishop to b4, which is a normal resource in this opening. h6 not as clear. As I said, it helps to prevent bishop g5 later on, but a bit of a strange move. Oddly enough, this position has been reached in other Grandmaster games on several occasions. So not as absurd as it might seem. But the game doesn't really lose its value because after a number of moves, we actually transpose back into what would be more or less mainline theory. So after a3, black played here d6. And the important thing is that black has prevented d4. He can count on the move a3 also being relatively useless for white in some variations. So d6 makes sense. Bishop b4 is stopped. Now if white wants to play b4, it's not absolutely clear that a3 was necessary for white. Both moves could result in something of a tempo loss, although that is a loss of time. Although here in this particular relatively closed position, that's not necessarily likely to be the case. White played knight to c3, black played g6. This is the obvious way to develop the bishop in the closed Sicilian type of position, or if you like, a King's Indian attack. g6, and now white could obviously play d4, but I think if he opts to turn it into a King's Indian, where he's playing d4, white really has to question the move and the usefulness of a3. So d3, staying in the realm of the English opening. And now what I think is a really important question about this whole opening, this whole business with h6 and a3. Black here played a5, but honestly, black has many variations in the English opening, this closed English with c4, e5, where he has many variations where he can play with or without the move a5. And I think in many cases, a5 is sort of playing on the weaker side, playing on the side where white has an advantage due to space. So a5 is not necessarily strategically the right plan all the time in such positions. And I'm just wondering here, is this not a situation where maybe the a3 move turns out to be a veritable waste of time, and we could play without a5 here for black, because playing with a5 justifies a3, as if the move order was like a5 and then white played a3, and sort of making it a useful move more or less, the a3. So a5 justifies a3. Alternatives there, you could just play bishop g7 and knight c6, something like that. So white now plays knight f3, which is normal in this setup, but I wanted to mention that you can also play e3. I think this is a totally viable alternative method of development from the game. e3 with the idea of knight on g to e2 would also be a perfectly viable way of basically white playing the black side of the closed Sicilian. It's up to you. Do you prefer this Petrosian position with knights on e2 and e3, or would you prefer to play a kind of classical English with a knight on f3? Artemiev opts for knight f3, which is less weakening, but maybe not quite as secure. The e3 knight on g to e2 usually leaves white with a somewhat secure king side, though it's more weakening overall. Knight f3, bishop g7, castles, and now rook to b1. And so by a very, very strange roundabout order of moves, we've actually reached a theoretical position here. And there are 3 moves in this position for black. The text move, bishop e6, is probably the least common. This is the move in the game, bishop to e6, preparing to play something like queen d7 or queen c8 and bishop h3, also putting pressure on the center on the d5 square. Obviously white doesn't have the resource knight to g5 that often bothers that bishop on e6, so h6 comes in handy. White doesn't have either knight g5 or bishop g5. Bishop g5 often trading off on f6 to get better control of the white squares on the long diagonal with the bishop on g2. So this h6 move ends up being useful, and the a3 move ends up being indispensable against a5. So the move's very, very relevant now. The roundabout way we reach the position, somewhat questionable. I don't think they planned it in advance, but who knows. This game ends up being a real bloody fight at the end, so I don't think it was a friendly prearranged game, to say the least. Bishop e6. Here, black could play knight to c6 instead. Let's take a look for a second. Typical main line of the English opening. For example, knight to c6 here, b4, a takes b4, a takes b4. This is a long and well-known variation. Bishop to e6. The Latvian Grandmaster Bagirov actually did a lot of work and published several books on these particular variations, and I think that there you can find this variation featuring among them as probably one of the main lines of the whole opening, maybe the main line of the entire opening of this English. So this is standard: b5, knight e7, bishop b2, queen d7, and then white can play either knight d2 or queen b3, or probably the rook a1, trying to take over the a file. And we have a question here. This is like kind of philosophical question about this English. Is the a5 plan good for black? You know, if ultimately white steals the a file, steals his action on the queen side, I guess that's a philosophical question. But bishop h3 and trading off the white squared bishop on g2, and I think chances are relatively balanced. Again, you can consult Bagirov's work on the English opening for more information about that. b4. Now, after bishop e6, b4 was played, and then a takes b4, a takes b4, and here we have c6. And this move to me doesn't seem absolutely necessary, although he wants to blunt the bishop on g2. I would think that you could play knight on b to d7 and develop a piece and wait and see what white does before deciding whether or not you want to play with c6 or not. But anyway, the text move is okay. c6, obviously white has b5 at some point, and it's hard for black to play d5 to blunt the bishop on g2 because the pawn on e5 may be hanging in some variations. So after c6, white played bishop d2. This is a new move as far as I could find in the chess databases. Bishop d2 is a theoretical novelty. Not the most aggressive move. Obviously, it doesn't really put any pressure, but it does develop the pieces, so it's inherently logical. White could also consider other moves. As I mentioned earlier, bishop to b2 would be an alternative way of development. And I did find one game in this position which went by the very logical continuation, b5. One of several games. b5, knight on b to d7. b5 makes much more sense to me than bishop d2, enhancing the bishop on g2, putting pressure on c6. And actually a pretty high-level game recently played in this position was the game Timofeyev versus Demchenko. This was played in 2015. b5, now knight on b to d7. And we could perhaps transpose to that game if we don't play bishop to d2. But bishop d2, okay, this is a reasonable move. And now black plays knight of bd7 anyway. And now a second novelty. It's not often you can play two theoretical novelties in one game, but that's what basically happens here. Artemiev would transpose to an old game, a relatively old game, with b5 here. It would be a game I believe played in Hungary in 1998. International masters Jules Lefebvre and Martin Senf from Hungary and Germany, respectively. Those two guys played a game with b5, which would transpose into a kind of normal position. But instead, Artemiev playing queen c1, which I'm not really sure if I like this move or not. It's consequent with bishop d2, but anyway, black doesn't really mind the king going to h7, having played h6. So it's slightly weakening, perhaps, the black king position, but not necessarily a big deal. And now white has a kind of classic problem. He doesn't seem to have any real play along the long diagonal, so he needs to stake out some claim in the center. And I think that e4 is quite a reasonable move. It seems counterintuitive to block the bishop on g2, but I myself, playing the English quite a bit lately, have been finding myself in this sort of exact position very often lately. And e4 seems like the kind of move that we have to make sometimes just to get a stake in the center. Now the position starts to get dynamic. Inarkiev is a very talented, very dangerous player, and he's aggressive and very sharp. He plays knight h5 in the spirit of the King's Indian, in the spirit of closed Sicilian, playing for attack. And white's setup with a knight on f3 and e4 is not really optimal strategically, because normally you want to be the first one to play along the f-file with a pawn break, and you can see white isn't really set up for that here. Knight on f3 instead of, say, on e2 or h3 or somewhere else where he could meet f5 with f4. So Artemiev, though, he's prepared. He plays queen c2, and you can see there's an x-ray against the black king on h7. So white doesn't intend to keep his central pawn on e4. After f5, he takes on f5, and this is basically forced now. G takes f. Bishop takes f would allow something like knight h4 with very strong tactical play for white. So black must take back with the pawn, and you can see the king on h7 is a little bit sensitive to the white queen on c2. I looked for immediate stuff here, didn't find anything. Now, white could play a number of moves. He played rook on f to e1. I was looking even at rook on a to e1, or perhaps even b5, but b5 now doesn't seem all that dangerous. It's still an option. Black perhaps has to be careful. Still on the long diagonal, it's open. But he played instead rook on f to e1. This move logically develops a piece, but there is some drawback for white that f2 is left a little bit less protected. When we're playing the English opening, we have to be careful prophylactically. In this kind of position where black has a little bit more space on the king's side, we might, have trouble along the f-file. So I would consider even rook on a to e1 or the more natural move b5, but rook on f to e1 certainly not a bad move. And now black could maneuver with like queen e8 perhaps here, but he doesn't want to put his queen on the e-file with the rook, so he plays instead queen f6, transferring to the king's side, and immediately jumping on that f-file where it looks like white might have left a little bit of an open path to f2, moving the f-rook to e1. Still, I think white's play is okay. Now, knight h4, interesting move. I'm still not sure if I like it or not, but I don't really want to say it's a bad move. It opens the bishop on g2, and itself isn't that vulnerable, though black could reposition, play bishop f6, and maybe hit the knight on h4. I don't want to criticize knight h4 as a bad move. He's putting pressure on the hanging pawns on f5, and black responds with queen f6. Sorry, queen f7, which defends the knight on h5. And queen f7 I don't mind. He wants to free up the f6 square. f6 is not really a natural square for the queen here. And there's even some pressure on the diagonal with the bishop e6, queen f7. Black could maybe think about e4 at some point later. But I think mostly he's just getting out of the way of his knight, one of his knights, to come to the natural square f6. Also protecting all your pieces. It's good not to leave your pieces hanging in general, just promotes tactical possibilities for the opponent. So queen f7 guarding the knight on h5. And now is the first move I really would openly criticize here. Bishop h3 from Artemiev. I think this is you're going a little too far here. Bishop h3, you know, in a positional sense, it makes sense. He's putting pressure on the hanging pawn on f5. But I felt like rook fe1, moving away from f2, and now bishop g2 h3, kind of moving the bishop away from the king. It looks like Artemiev is setting himself up for a situation where he doesn't have that good defense around his king. And the bishop on h3, if it gets traded off, which is often black's goal in these variations, to play bishop h3 and bishop takes g2 to weaken the white king side. Is Artemiev just sort of tempting fate here by like setting up an exchange of bishops on black's terms? So instead of bishop h3, I didn't really understand why white just didn't continue naturally with a move here, b5. I mean, to me, it looks like the most obvious move in the world, accentuating the bishop on g2, putting pressure on c6, like a normal closed Sicilian, trying to get black to like give up the c6 pawn or trade on b5 or something like that. And maybe it's possible that Artemiev was afraid of like d5 for black, something along those lines. But I still think it's the best move. Bishop h3 is dubious, and now we have some interesting possibilities. Black to played rook on a to e8, which is a perfectly good move. The a file, there's nothing really happening there, and naturally Inarkiev is focusing on the king side. Now the bishop on h3 in strange position could be traded off. There's the f file breakthrough at f2. So speaking of which, it's a very interesting possibility here for Inarkiev to go on the offensive with the move f4, and obviously trading the bishops. So I looked first at d4 check, but there doesn't seem to be anything really here. After d4 check, king g8, bishop takes e6, queen takes e6. It looks like white maybe just overextended themselves. And the following ending, like queen g6, queen takes g6, knight takes g6, rook f6, and white is awkwardly placed. Ultimately, I think he just weakened himself by playing d4, and probably black is slightly better. After knight e7 check, king f7, white has nowhere to go. So d4 check after f4, not a big deal. We'd probably have to trade on e6, queen takes e6, and then white has to defend carefully here. I looked at queen d1, knight back to f6. There's a trick there, queen d1, knight back to f6, and now bishop takes f4. But this actually loses. This is double question mark variation for white. Bishop takes f4 and queen h3, threatening knight g4. With massive threats on f2 and h2, white will have to resign or lose a piece very, very quickly. So this variation doesn't really work out well for white. Instead of bishop takes f4, though, in this position, white can respond with something more natural here. King g2, kind of looking dangerous, but this is what we get when we play bishop h3. We're not really respecting the safety of our king, so we have to be very careful now. King g2, I analyzed f takes g, h takes g, and then d5, occupying the center with pawns. And the game is anybody's game, I think, at this point. If Inarkiev had played this way, I would evaluate it as about equal. Maybe c takes d5, c takes d5. Chances for both sides here. All the pieces for both sides fairly active, and I think an interesting game overall. Neither king all that safe. Perhaps white could even go rook h1 and turn the tables on the king side. So I don't know. It was an interesting possibility, but not necessarily better than the text move rook on a to e8. Now white played rook e2, kind of a neutral move, preparing possibly to double, also protecting the f2 square. And now a weird move from Inarkiev, which I really don't like. The knight is like hanging out there on h4, ready to drop in on g6 at some point, and obviously Inarkiev is playing like a King's Indian, and normal square is h8, but I thought that the way the game goes down, I don't really think that this King's Indian is going to be like a situation where the g file necessarily plays a big role. Maybe black's going to play f4. So king g8, I thought, actually looks like the safer square for the black king here. I guess it's easy to say in retrospect, but he played king h8. I really thought that king g8 might be superior. Artemiev now plays b5, but he doesn't have the bishop to really enforce any threats against c6 or whatnot. And Inarkiev takes the initiative, plays f4, which is very strong. Bishop takes e6, and I think this exchange gives black, you know, the kind of kingside attacking chances that you're looking for in these sort of variations. So the whole plan of bishop h3, very, very rickety and risky for white. Bishop takes, rook takes. Obviously, he doesn't want the queen on e6 opposite that rook, and the rook kind of joins the party here on e6. B takes c, opening the b file. B takes c. And I think this is still pretty balanced. Probably the best for white is a tactical line that was hard to see. Probably Artemiev considered the move knight e4, but rejected it because of d5. But after d5, he has a shot here. C takes d5, c takes d5, bishop b4. And this line looks pretty good for white. He's maintaining the balance in this position, bishop b4. If we take two pieces for the rook, it looks equal. D takes e4, bishop takes f8, bishop takes f8, and then d takes e4. Little imbalanced, but I think that objectively this position would be about equal with a rook and two pawns for the two pieces. All the pawns on the same side. And the rooks have decent scope here, so it's about equal. But again, Artemiev gets a little out of line with an optimistic move here that I just don't think I could bring myself to play. He was maybe panicking because he saw knight e4, didn't like it, didn't see bishop b4, something like that. So he doesn't have king g2. So he panicked a little bit, played g4. This move, it's kind of dangerous, but I don't say like white's losing, just it's very risky. Obviously it's your king side, so you have to take care. It looks dangerous to me. So g4, and very strong and sharp response immediately from Inarkiev. f3, taking the initiative. Now, again, probably second best move from Artemiev. Hard to find this necessarily, but rook e4 looks like a solid move, and the idea would be like Tigran Petrosian, speaking of whom, the second Tigran Petrosian might have found this move, I think. I've done some video of his game in English recently. I think he's a good defender. He would find rook e4. Maybe sacrificing the exchange here for a pawn. Rook e4, knight f6, h3, exclamation point. Sacking the exchange for like complete white square sort of blockade, like knight takes e4, knight takes e4, with a retreating back to g3. This absolutely looks like, with black having a bad bishop here, white having a lot of good squares for the knights, I think this is absolute compensation for the exchange. So a great Petrosian-like exchange sacrifice. Rook e3, not as good. Keeping the square free for the knight on e4, but blocking the bishop that could knock out the knight coming to f4. So that discoordination in the white camp there between the bishop on d2, rook on e3, I don't really like. And now Inarkiev missed a strong move, which wasn't that easy to see. He didn't play this. It looks very powerful. Queen to e7, and nearly winning. Black is better. Queen e7, and sacking a pawn temporarily. But the play along the f file is very powerful now. Knight takes f3 and knight f4, of course, possible because of the move rook e3, with just great compensation for black. Knight f4, knight e4, rook g6, and you actually can't defend this pawn on g4. So I like black here. Give the pawn up, rook takes g4. Black has the initiative, and the white king looks a little bit lonely. So slight advantage to black there. Instead, Inarkiev played a very aggressive move, but a bit too optimistic. e4. Trying to open up the position for his pieces. You know, the bishop on g7 plays to d4 in some lines, and obviously the knight can come to e5. But this was just too optimistic. Queen e7 was just a very good move. Now white is okay again, and rook takes e4 is probably correct. And now knight on d to f6. And things start to get highly tactical, because black is leaving that knight hanging on h5, but he has very, very strong tactical resources. Knight df6, rook takes e6, queen takes e6, and obviously threatening queen takes g4, queen g4, and queen takes h4, getting the piece back. So this was an interesting position where at this point we had very, very nice possibility of a tactical sequence. So knight g6 check, king to g8, and then h3. And this is a safe move guarding the g4 point. And now knight takes g4 when it really gets very complicated tactically. Knight takes g4. At this point, it's unclear, and I've analyzed some very long lines here. So knight takes f8, I think more or less forced. We cannot take on g4. We'll get checkmated here in this line for sure. So knight takes f8, and now there are several possibilities in this position for black. We can possibly just take back on f8. We can play the text move in the game, which I think is dubious. Queen f5. I mean, from a pure standpoint of analysis, it's dubious. This move is very reasonable in the heat of battle, but not the best. Very interesting line here for black. Bishop d4. Bishop d4 probably doesn't work, but I think it's possible that Inarkiev could have spent a good amount of time looking at it. There's a fantastic variation here. After bishop d4, I wanted to show everyone this line I found. Bishop d4, bishop e3. And now queen takes bishop, sacrificing the queen. This could have happened. It's basically like a forced variation. Queen takes e3, and then f takes e3. Bishop takes e3 check. We're going to get a lot of material for the queen and almost a mating net. King f1, only move. Knight g3 check, only move. King e1, only move. f2 check, and now white has to give the queen back with queen takes f2. This is all forced. Now black needs to take with a knight to actually not allow the white king, to escape off the back rank. Knight takes f2. When white is up the exchange, but black has to save his piece, so he has to play knight to e6. And now knight takes d3 check, winning a pawn. Still the white king condemned to the back rank. King d1. And knight e5, hitting another pawn on c4. However, rook b7, I don't know how far Inarkiev probably analyzed this, but I could imagine wasting a lot of time looking at lines like this where it turns out white is clearly better in this ending with the threat of rook g7, and all these moves are forced. So I would imagine Inarkiev possibly burning a lot of time looking at this long variation with bishop to d4. So instead of this, we do have another possibility here. Going back to the game, after knight takes f8, there is king takes f8. Bishop takes f8 just really doesn't look that great. It inactivates the bishop, and I don't think there's anything too terrible. As you'll see, after king takes f8, rook b8 check, king f7, and white has to defend very carefully here. And we found another great move. Queen d1, we cannot take on g4 for white. So queen d1 defending, and now black has an absolutely amazing sequence here, which would have been very hard to find without quite a bit of time. I'm sure Inarkiev could find it depending on the clock time, but knight h2, and a really study-like position. Threatening queen takes h3, defending f3 by sacrificing a piece, and if you take the piece, king takes h2, bishop e5, and it's game over. White is getting mated by force. So he would have had to settle for a draw. This actually might have been a forced draw after this line. King takes f8, rook b8 check, king f7, queen d1, knight h2, double exclamation point, and now a draw because of rook b7 check. This move interferes with black's plans. If the king goes up to somewhere like g6, it's going to discoordinate his position. So king back to f8, and now rook takes g7 is a line the computer analyzed, and a really funny ending here. That's a draw. Queen takes h3, rook g6, king f7, and now queen e1, king takes rook, and it's a draw by repetition. It's equal material almost, and draw by repetition. Queen e8 check, king h7, queen e4 check, king h8, queen e8 check, king h7. That just, I thought, was a really entertaining variation that could have happened. So it turns out that king f8, probably black's best move. But over the board, very hard with like 10 moves to make the time control or whatnot. Very hard for black to find the correct move here. He played queen f5. It was a creative try, but it only fails in one line that white was unable to find. So we've got to give queen f5 kind of credit as a good practical move. Rook b8, this is best. And now bishop takes f8. And here Artemiev missed like the almost impossible to find variation. Only, I guess, one move that really would have saved him here. Again, found by the computer. It's logical, though. It's very logical. You'd like to play d4 in this position, but you can't because your queen is hanging. You'd like to challenge that queen on f5. If you could, black's only active piece, you'd be winning the game. So the plan is actually queen b1. Queen b1, defending the queen, and also creating possibilities of rook takes f8 check, and then the queen showing up again, which I'll show you in a minute in a very neat variation on b8. So queen b1, maybe the only move for white. And now knight f4, bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, and there's a very long line here that's an interesting ending by force. We actually get to a table-based ending. H takes g4, queen takes g4 check, king f1, queen check, king e1, queen check, king d2. All this is forced. Queen takes f2 check, king c1, queen e1 check, and then knight d1. And black's almost winning because he has f2. But there's this study like rook takes f8 check, king takes f8, queen b8 check, king e7, queen a7 check, picking off the pawn on f2. But that's not the end, because the ending is almost a draw for black. King e6, queen takes f2, queen takes f2. I don't think you can avoid an exchange of queens there. You're going to lose the h6 pawn and just lose with queen and knight versus queen. So black has to try for the king, active king in this ending, and outside pawn. It's almost enough. King f5, king d2, king f4, knight e4. Of course, in a practical game, white might have gone wrong. h5, knight takes d6. There are other lines, but none of them seem to save for black. h4, king e2, h3, king f2, king e5, knight b7, and this is where we reach the table-based position. h2, king g2, king d4, king takes h2, king takes d3, c5. And black is lost, because he'll be losing the king and pawn ending. When we go back and collect the knight, white will have king d6, king c8, king takes c6 with opposition in the end of the game. Almost a forced variation. So this would have been pretty hard to find with white, but queen b1 is, this position is the key move in this position, queen b1. Instead he played a very natural move, knight e4, and Inarkiev found the answer, which is an amazing move for this amazing game. Both sides, they're humans, not computers. Really you need a computer to play such a sharp position, but queen g6, exclamation point, with massive threats against the white king. And here white had a chance to save the game, maybe with bishop g5. To toss this piece with bishop g5 in the way would have been the only way for white to try to really put up a lot of resistance. Instead he played knight to g3, which is a very big blunder. And then black, Inarkiev had the shot knight takes f2, undermining the g3 piece, and white is suddenly desperate. Rook takes f8 check, king takes f8, bishop takes h6 check, and now Inarkiev it's his turn to blunder here. Probably in time pressure. Again, king g8. He doesn't have to take this bishop. It's just a gut reaction. He doesn't have to take the bishop. King g8. And he's clearly better after king g8, although this isn't easy. Queen takes f2, knight takes g3, king h2, knight e2. We have a very nice queen and knight combination versus bishop. Bishop e3, queen f5, this is analysis, and then bishop b6, queen f6. Hard to say this is a win for black, but it's probably very, very good chances in a practical game. The very powerful passed pawn, almost zugzwang for white, and a strong queen and knight combination would make it very hard for white to find perfect moves to save himself. So I say clear advantage for black. But Inarkiev, probably in time pressure here, just automatically recaptured on h6, And suddenly white is okay. Queen takes f2, queen c1 check, and again, I guess this is a time scramble. The tragedy happened now, where white is drawing. It looks like knight f1, queen g5 check, king h2, queen f4 check, king g1, with a likely repetition of position, most likely a draw, unless one side just loses on time or something. Instead, after this move, queen c1 check, Artemiev, after this epic battle here, finally falters. He plays queen f1, allowing the classic knight fork, knight takes g3. And white loses, has to resign here because of queen takes c1, knight e2 check, winning a piece. We've all had this happen at some point, allowing the knight to capture something and then fork, getting the material back and winning the game. A really, really crazy time scramble-like situation which decided this epic game. I thought so many interesting study-like variations and possibilities. Obviously kind of hard to keep up with it all. I wanted to pack it into watchable video. We're under 35, 37 minutes for this video, but I think that I did the best I could kind of packing it all in. A lot of interesting stuff. You could spend hours analyzing this game from the Russian Team Championship. Again, Artemiev versus Inarkiev. Inarkiev victorious. A little bit lucky here at the end, and we've seen a lot of mistakes, but really, really interesting game. Kind of classic English or reverse Sicilian, reverse closed Sicilian, where both sides attacking on opposite flanks, but eventually black overcoming white. The white king, bishop h3 and g4, these were risky moves. I mean, Artemiev played the game in a somewhat risky fashion in respect to his king. Ultimately, couldn't find the resources he needed to save it. But I thought a fantastic game. Grandmaster Chess Lessons Part 6 here. I'm International Master William Paschall, and this presentation was here for video chess training on YouTube. Again, from the Russian Team Championship, Artemiev and Inarkiev. Thanks for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe and like. Very exciting game here. Thanks and bye-bye.